Today I'm going to be presenting some of my work from my ongoing PhD on the psychosocial relationship between nation, identity and Brexit. So I want to start this presentation by stating the importance of utilising the discipline of political psychology when discussing themes around Brexit. As Anderson and Wilson argue, Brexit was an act of voting that quickly morphed into intense attached political and national identifications. Brexit quickly became an occasion for widespread dissent and complex enactment and reproduction of existing power relations, attachments, and inequalities that intensified, revealed, and foregrounded existing divides of class, age, ethnicity, race, locality, and identification, while also cutting across other commonalities. And I argue that these aspects are foregrounded by the psychological processes that we enact, particularly when in heightened political climates of uncertainty and anxiety. Therefore, I think it is important to consider approaches to these issues that account for the sociological, emotional, cultural, historical, and psychological contexts and forces that influence political thought and sentiment. And so this brings me to the psychosocial approach. So psychosocial theory studies the interrelation of social and psychoanalytical thought while also taking into account the political, social, and cultural context that influences thought, emotion, and behaviour. Psychosocial studies uses psychoanalytic concepts and together with principles from the social sciences and humanities to address and highlight issues within society and politics. So the psychological, sociological, political, and cultural are considered as having an influence on the way that we construct social life through relationships, feelings, and action. It aims to challenge the fixity of disciplinary boundaries and instead move to an interdisciplinarity. And so psychosocial theory basically aids the exploration of identification, defense mechanisms, anxiety, the role of the unconscious, researcher reflexivity, whilst also acknowledging people in their cultural, their social and historical circumstances to allow insight into how data is structured and constructed. And so it's an important tool in understanding how the unconscious plays a part in the structure of people's reality and how people perceive others. So ultimately, this approach allows researchers to research participants and their political sentiments in their cultural, social, and historical context, whilst also allowing insight into their psychological motivations and defences. And so by acknowledging these underlying unconscious thought processes and behaviour, we can add a deeper nuanced understanding to political behaviour and social thought to existing approaches within the field of political studies. And so this brings me to my overall general questions of my PhD. So I'm seeking to find out what is the relationship between nation, identity and political sentiment, and also how this relationship manifests itself psychosocially with specific regard to the expression and the construction of national identity. And so I use a psychosocial approach to understand the data that I collected. Now I used in-depth interviews, so it was all qualitative. And so something important to say is that, like many qualitative researchers, I do not intend to make any generalizations with my data and imply that my findings and my analysis is representative of the whole population or all Leave voters or all British people. Rather, this is a nuanced approach to these individual accounts. And so firstly, I want to talk about the way that participants express their national identity to me and how I've been exploring it with psychoanalytic terms of narcissism and melancholia. And so I'm going to take you through some excerpts of some of my interviews. And so after participants identified as British, they then described themselves as patriotic in some cases. And so I asked, why? Did they have any pride in anything particular? What is patriotism to them? And interestingly, I found the majority of participants went straight to talking about military achievements, Britain's historical interventions on the world stage or territory acquired by the empire and so forth. So we had this participant say, the biggest one for me, because I was young enough to remember it, was the Falklands War. We were a nation that was shrinking. We had a large country that took over one of our territories, but we still managed to muster an armada. And we sent the best troops we had and we took back what was ours. Another participant said that they like the way we stand up for the island in Spain. I take lots of pride in Britain. I've travelled to India loads of times and I take pride in what we did there. Without us having been in India, they wouldn't have had the infrastructure, the railway, the bridges, the buildings that they have now, because they are a mess and were a mess after we left. I've travelled through the whole of Africa, and when you see what Britain did in those countries, they would be nowhere without having the British infrastructure put in place by us. And then lastly, this participant said, I'm proud of all of the historical interventions that we made, whether it's the First World War, the Second World War, not too proud of the Boer War, but all of the things that on the surface Britain's tried to do and achieve in the world. And so thinking about these sentiments expressed by participants, we can understand their national identity and their patriotism being based on ideas from Smith, Kelman and Bell, who argue that collective memories help a society incorporate its national identity into their personal identity to understand how they can be a part of how they view the world. And in a psychoanalytic sense, we have this kind of collective unconsciousness of a nation that is expressed through its celebration of historical narratives, its myths and its culture, which are inscribed in the mind of its members. We have things like national holidays, commemorations, monuments and statues that function as mnemonic national symbols for people to internalize and form their identity around. Sigmund Freud writes in 5 lectures of psychoanalysis that such monuments can cause one to cling to the past emotionally. They cannot get free of the past, and for its sake they neglect what is real and what is immediate in front of them. And we can see this amongst nationalistic behaviour. So the pathology is experienced by the collective group. They are bound together with enhanced self-esteem via the nation's history and traumatic or triumphant histories. And so psychoanalysis of Amick Vulcan identifies and defines national identity as something that is based on these chosen events throughout histories, or these chosen myths. And these can be triumphs or traumas. And this is where the idealization of one's group is tied together with narcissistic grandiosity. And so perhaps we can think of the empire, the British Empire, as functioning as one of those chosen triumphs or traumas. Simmons describes the empire as pathological. They say that a portrait of narcissism is a grandiose sense of superiority, alternating with feelings of loss, rage, and revenge. And also these feelings of loss materialised amongst participants when prompted on Brexit and Britain's current standing in the world. So one participant said, I wish we were still in empire. I asked why, and they said, because the world is in such a state at the moment, and I think we could easily be walked over, which is why I'm actually pleased we left the EU. I'd like to see the Commonwealth stay strong, but I wouldn't want to be part of the EU. I'm glad we aren't in that. Another participant said, I was very sad to see the British Empire go. I asked, why was that? They said, I think the strength. When we were an empire, we're only a little island, and the fact that the empire gave us strength and, a standing in the world, which meant we couldn't be stood all over and walked on. And then finally, this participant said, personally, Brexit for me was all about reclaiming our identity as a country. I asked them to elaborate on that, and they said, we are a very proud nation. We have a very long history, which I don't believe we are allowed to celebrate anymore. Yes, we aren't an empire nation anymore, but we once were. And so this brings me to melancholia. So melancholia can occur when there is an inability to mourn a loss. This occurs particularly as part of denying unpleasant realities due to its disturbance of what Freud called the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is a driving force of part of our unconscious that seeks immediate gratification of our needs, our wants, and our urges. And so we can understand this pleasure principle being disturbed, particularly when my participants were faced with the harsh realities of the historical narratives that they had emotionally invested in, which at the time of speaking to them were triggered by the surge of support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer. And so participants said things like, the whole BLM thing, I found it very offensive. Someone else said the stories about Baden-Powell were completely untrue, so, denying it. And then another participant said they're pulling down statues of our history, and that makes me so cross because the people we've got statues up for did some bad things, but they also did some good things. And so this melancholia, we can understand it as indulging in myth and manipulation of historical narratives in order to navigate unpleasant emotions that we're faced with. It's widely acknowledged that the concept of past glories of the British Empire is ingrained in the psyche of much of the population, the collective psyche of the population. And we can understand that this has been exacerbated by Brexit, particularly amongst narratives of an independent global Britain reclaiming its place in the world. So why does this happen? Well, perhaps we can understand, narcissism and melancholia as defense mechanisms that have been characterized by British nationalism, British exceptionalism, and ultimately Brexit. So as defense mechanisms, these are to ward off uncomfortable feelings of anxiety and uncertainty that people are faced with living under conditions like neoliberalism, experiencing a global pandemic, rapid societal transformations, and globalization. And so anxiety is an experience that collectively affects us all, that is generated at the threat of a loss or an absence of something good, and the threat or the presence of something bad. So as stated by Anderson, again, Brexit has been interpreted as both a symptom of uncertainty and as a compensation for it. Modern globalized neoliberal living has gone beyond the mental capability of most people to grasp, and Brexit and the rise of right-wing populism are the symptoms of this backlash due to the challenges presented to those who have not been able to locate their identity. So in these times of anxiety, uncertainty, and identity instability, individuals and groups may find themselves being tied into social cohesion and blind followership to national or religious or political groups, which offers emotional containment. And I'll come back to this term in a moment. But furthermore, on defense mechanisms, Melanie Klein's paranoid schizoid theory can be useful because she describes how in times of uncertainty and anxiety, we may regress to our early infancy developmental states of mind, where when confronted with anxiety or uncertainty, we may abandon complexities and instead elect a simplistic version of reality that offers a safer or a more pleasurable alternative. And this is usually characterized by a black and white, very binary worldview, which is where we might see polarization. And so this worldview that is adopted in defense and in aiming to ward off negative emotions is dangerously simplistic. Christopher Bollers describes this process in political life as the idea of moving away from complexity and towards a new simplicity that brings relief and then is consolidated when people find themselves as part of interlocking communities of like-minded people. When such regression takes place and groups within people and groups, they may retreat into territorial, national, ethnic, and political enclaves, which correspond with Freud's ideas on the death drive, particularly when characterized by aggression and self-destructiveness. Corresponds with my participants position, where in order to defend against uncomfortable or negative feelings, we split into a polarized state and enact othering by projecting our negative emotions onto all objects, people, groups that we deem bad in order to achieve emotional stability. And so to finish, I just want to end on discussing the importance of the nation as a container, an emotional container, similar to what I mentioned earlier. And so Barry Richards explores Wilfred Bion's concept of containment. He describes containing environments which are necessary to meet individual and collective emotional needs. Within politics and the nation state lies the psychological dimension of identity and belonging, which are emotionally containing, as the nation state acts as a provider, sort of as a caregiver. And we can think of this from the law courts all the way to the recycling collection. However, the effects of neoliberalism on the state has meant that the state's ability to perform its role as the foundation of societal containment means that this psychological fulfillment is harder to find within the public sphere. And this impacts the nation's cohesiveness and unity. When these containing qualities are absent, it is possible for disenchanted people to see appeal in regressing and indulging in narratives of nationhood that are foregrounded by melancholia, narcissism, and nationalist sentiments. And so with psychological fulfillment from our nation, state and government, we may find more emotional balance on a collective level, particularly if the narcissistic ideal is projected onto a more peaceable, inclusive, generous vision of the nation. I am interested to see in future if these sentiments I've highlighted today continue as we experience our first year out of the EU and as we continue battling with the COVID-19 pandemic.